when they started living together, it was later in Medina, okay, that she had reached the age of maturity or puberty. Yes,
right.
That's the understanding. In fact, in the books of Islamic law, marriage between children was allowed to be enacted by parents, okay, and then when the child reaches puberty, they can actually say no. So when they become an adult, they could actually say, no, I don't actually want to be married to this person. And they could have their marriage annulled. So now they have what you call legal capacity, right? They could say no. But there's another element of, there's some other elements of so-called child marriage that I want to address. And that is that even today, in many parts of the world, especially the poorer parts of the world, marriage is seen as a way to safeguard your child's future. You know, imagine if you're in a very poor area, and this happens even today, from my knowledge, in places like India, Pakistan, or Bangladesh. You know, there are sometimes parents who are very poor. They have many, many children. And the idea that somebody who is wealthy or who is able will agree to marry their child, okay, is like a blessing to them. You know, it means that you've safeguarded my child's future. Now my child is, when they get to the age, they're going to be looked after. So I think we do have to appreciate, especially living in the luxurious and relatively comfortable West, that people have very different realities in different parts of the world. Now, that doesn't mean that because that was the norm in those days, that we have to now adopt that, because it's not obligatory. It's not an obligation or anything like that, you know. In fact, most Muslim majority countries now have enacted in their laws ages of consent, if you like, that are at least 16 or 18, you know. However, I would say puberty, just purely looking at it from a natural perspective, is a much more reasonable age, if you think about it, okay? A marker, I would say, much more reasonable marker, because remember, at puberty, also certain other things are kicking in. For example, desires, you know. So you have young people with desires, and you're saying to them, you can't get married. Okay. Now that works in the West. And the reason why it works in the West is that people are sexually active anyway, regardless of marriage. Right?
Yeah.
So I remember at school, you know, my friends, I went to a girls' school in Barnet, in London, just north of London. And we had girls who were 14, at least 13, 14, who had boyfriends, who, not just boyfriends. One of the girls, she just moved out of her parents' house and moved in with somebody, you know. They probably weren't allowed to do that legally. But the point is that even in the West, young people are sexually active. So remember, for Muslims, we don't want our children to be sexually active. We don't want them to be sexually active outside of marriage. So I think all of that context is very important. And also...
Yeah, so I just want to say that also, just to widen for a second, that anthropological studies have shown that the biblical norm for marriage in the world was the same, actually, puberty.
Right.
So when I mean marriage, sorry, I mean, be careful what I say here, I mean consummation of a marriage. So that marriage, exactly. Betrothing could happen before that, but the actual consummation happened when the body was physically designed to have children. And so this seems to be the norm in traditional cultures throughout history, really, actually. So modern,
absolutely.
Recent notions of, you know, teenagehood, you know, adolescence and all this are very recent inventions, partly from America in the 1960s and before that. So we see them as natural and normal now, but actually they're quite recent, and they're not based on physiology or biology. They're based on certain understandings in our era about childhood, and it's getting later and later and later, you know, childhood.
And also perhaps they're a type of artificial elongation of childhood, you know?
Yeah. Exactly.
I was watching. Sorry, I was going to say I was watching. Probably shouldn't admit this, but I was watching A Christmas Carol, okay, by Charles Dickens. I was watching the film of it, and there's a scene where Bob Cratchit talks to his son, and his son is like a little kid, you know, like literally maybe 10 or under, younger than 10 even, right? And he bends down and he says to his son, he says, "I've just spoken to Mr. So-and-so in the village, in the city, you know, and he said, you can become his apprentice, right? He'll give you a job." And the little boy, and he's such a little boy, you know, it's quite laughable actually, because I was showing my sons and saying, look at you guys and look at him, right? He's a little kid and he's like getting an apprenticeship in the city. And he goes, oh, then I'll be able to help you and mum, you know? And it was a sweet little scene, but it really brought home that even just in Victorian times, you know, children had to work, and they didn't consider themselves children as such. You know, they literally matured and grew up very quickly because they had to, because life expectancy was shorter. That's actually quite an important factor if you think about it. We in our times live what, an average age of, I think in Britain it's like 70 plus, right?
Yep.
So the average age, life expectancy is 70 in our times. Obviously, a life of 70 years is going to be different. We're going to look at it differently than what it was in their times. In the Prophet's time, the life expectancy was about 37. The average life expectancy was 37. That's like half of what it is today. So if life expectancy is shorter, each stage is going to be sped up, right? Like you want to get married, you want to have kids as soon as possible. Why? Because first of all, it's probably going to mean you're going to have kids, right? And also your kids are more likely to survive. So people had more kids in those days because the child mortality rate was so high. You might have, like, same, just as the Prophet ﷺ, he had a number of sons, but they passed away, right? It was quite normal for children to pass away. So if you wanted to have children, and remember, children were also a type of wealth for people. You know, when you, and that's not the case nowadays. People don't view having children and having a big family as part of your wealth or prestige or status, you know. In those days, children were part of your, were a blessing, were seen as a blessing, as part of your wealth. If you had sons, they could defend your tribe and clan, right? If you had daughters, that means that your family would grow, right? So it's a completely different paradigm of looking at life, looking at marriage as well. And remember, marriage was the norm. In our times, marriage is becoming not the norm, or it pretty much is not the norm, especially in Western countries. So people are sexually active regardless of marriage. But if you want your children to be chaste and you want them to be married, you're going to try and secure that future for them, right, as soon as possible.